Paul Smith. He's joining us from Nottingham. He's an associate professor of French history and politics at the University of Nottingham. Paul Smith, good to have you with us. So we heard there some of the charge sheet levelled against France. So why now? Why is there perhaps going to be a reckoning with what French officials did in Africa all those years ago?
I don't think it's so much a reckoning. I think it's what Macron, the candidate in 2017, began to try to shift France's attitude towards its relations with Africa. And what we're seeing tomorrow, the summit, is the latest in a series of summits, which were actually started in 1973. It's something like the 26th or the 28th meeting of the Franco-African Summit. But what is fundamentally different this time is that it's not a meeting of the French head of state with heads of states in Africa. It's a meeting of the French head of state, but with groups are representing industry, youth organizations in Africa. It's all been organized by the Cameroonese intellectual Achille Mbembe, and he's been setting it up. So it's a very different, it's an attempt by Macron to, the French use the word refondation, and I think in English we would talk about it being an attempt to reset the relationship with Africa. Now, of course, that's also complicated because Africa is not a country. It's lots of different countries and it's lots of very different countries and peoples. But it is an attempt. And what's also interesting here is that Mbembe has also brought in not just people in Africa, but also representatives of the African diaspora. So there's an attempt going on here to reset the relationship between France and Africa. And that is being led not just by Paris, but also there's this input from Mbembe, and he's been involved in something like 60 meetings, debates with people in Africa, with representatives of the African diaspora and so forth. So that's what we're seeing here, is this attempt to shift the relationship, the nature of the relationship at this point.
And shift it to what, Professor Smith? Because it does come at an interesting time, doesn't it, for France, not just France, but for many European nations and their relations with their former colonial powers. We've seen words of conciliatory words from the German government. The British government has done it in the past. The Dutch government also having to address their colonial legacy. But France in particular, as you say, wants to try and reset, but that reset comes without any sort of acceptance of perhaps acceptance in African nations' opinion, which would involve money, of the damage that was done.
No, absolutely. I would agree with you. The problem for Macron is that domestically speaking, there is still this very strong idea amongst the French people of the civilizing mission, that France's presence in Africa was, this is the very 19th century colonial idea. I'm not disputing that, but absolutely, it's very difficult to convince the French people who have this image of themselves as having been a positive influence in Africa. And I think it's a debate that needs to happen in Britain as well, actually. I don't think that Britain has gone through this process yet. But it is this idea of trying to rewrite, Mbembe, in the report that he delivered to Macron on Tuesday, talked about this idea of rewriting the history of France from the African perspective and accepting that actually French identity is based on all kinds of things, and it also needs to be seen not as just something that's ethno-religious in the sense of being white and Catholic, but it's much more complicated than that. But from Macron's perspective, the idea of the French, particularly the French right, and of course, if we look at French politics, there's a big argument going on in France about identity. Bringing that argument to the table is going to be very difficult in the process leading up to the presidential election. So it's part of this, part of the whole questioning of what underpins the relationship between former colonial powers and the former colonized, and that is a very big debate which France has to have with itself.
I agree with you entirely. It reminds me a little bit as well of the argument had in the United States over the 1619 Project and the writing again of American history. But just sticking with France and its relationship for now, and finally then, Professor Smith, as you mentioned, there are elections coming in France, and of course President Macron will be looking to his right, as there are two candidates on that side who are sort of vying for his job. And this comes as France are withdrawing their troops from Operation Barkhane in the Sahel, and also got a bit of a spat going on with Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria, sorry. So it comes as sort of a dual track, while reaching out with one hand, but also retrenchment on another.
Well, that again is another aspect. If we go back to what I said about the relationship with Africa, actually, you know, Africa is not monolithic, is it? It's lots of different states, and the relationship, particularly with Algeria, you mentioned, is a difficult one. And again, we're seeing that amongst even the candidates now. You know, you mentioned at the top of the report that the war ended in 1962, but sometimes you feel that you have to say to some people in France, the war is over. And they're not really, they haven't really come to terms with that. But yes, I mean, the underpinning of, you know, there's the relationship with state leaders. That's going to be framed in a different way, by the way. France wants to do that in the relationship discussion between Europe and heads of state. But yes, there are difficult times at the moment in terms of visa regulations, for example, for North Africans who want to go back to or come from North Africa to France. The military presence of France in Africa has been in various different places. Chad, Mali has been undermined, and of course that also links to the relationship with the Anglo-Saxon world, because all of these things connect. You know, submarines in Australia have an impact in what's happening in Africa, Afghanistan, and so forth. So it is incredibly complex. But what is interesting about tomorrow is that it has neo-colonial overtones, but it is about not talking to leaders of states, but leaders of other organizations coming out of that kind of statist relationship, and talking to business leaders, industry leaders, African youth. Whether it will actually change very much, who knows? It's the nth time that people have tried to reset the relationship. But at least now the dialogue is actually, at least there's a dialogue of equals. It's not a dialogue that's completely Paris-centric.
No, you're exactly right. Okay, Professor Paul Smith, I could talk to you about this all day, but we do have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your analysis. I appreciated that. Thank you.